The city buzzed with excitement as Adana's wedding filled every news headline. She was the woman every young girl wanted to be, elegant, powerful, and soon to be married to Chief Raymond, a billionaire known for his influence and wealth. Every corner of the venue dripped with luxury, golden chandeliers, marble floors, and floral designs that cost more than a mansion. Guests arrived in convoys of expensive cars, stepping out in shimmering lace and polished shoes. Photographers clicked non-stop, capturing every detail of the event that had already been tagged as the wedding of the year. Adana's beauty commanded the room, her white gown hugging her like a dream. Her mother stood by, proud and tearful, whispering blessings over her. Everything looked perfect, but beneath her smile hid a heart that was never at peace. Far outside the gate, behind the security post, sat a man in torn clothes. His beard was overgrown, his eyes hollow, and his hands shook from hunger. His name was Odogwu. No one noticed him. The security men mocked him, asking him to move away from the gate. But he didn't. He stayed there, staring through the fence at the bride, whispering a name only he knew, Adana. The ceremony began with music that filled the massive hall. Everyone turned to watch as Adana walked down the long aisle, her dress sweeping gracefully across the floor. Chief Raymond waited proudly, his suit perfectly tailored, his face glowing with pride. Cameras followed every step she took, and the guests whispered praises about how perfect the couple looked. As Adana reached the altar, she looked around and smiled at the crowd, the kind of smile that carried both triumph and pain. She saw faces she hadn't seen in years. Important people, wealthy families, even some government officials. But what she didn't see was the one man who mattered most. Her chest tightened as memories flashed through her mind. Her father's face, his voice, his struggles. The day she walked away from him, promising never to return until she made it in life. She had kept that promise. And now, he was nowhere to be found. The ceremony went on, each step carefully planned and rehearsed. But as the priest lifted his hand to bless the couple, Adana's vision blurred. A sharp pain shot through her chest. Her breathing quickened, and before anyone could react, she collapsed in front of everyone. The hall erupted in panic. Guests screamed, some rushing forward, others backing away in fear. Chief Raymond froze, unsure of what to do. The medical team on standby ran forward, checking her pulse. They worked frantically, but her heartbeat grew weaker with every passing second. The crowd began to murmur. Some whispered that it was a spiritual attack. Others said it was exhaustion or bad luck. Chief Raymond called for an ambulance, shouting at everyone to move aside. But no one noticed the thin figure forcing his way through the gate outside. It was Odogwu. When he heard the commotion and the sirens, something inside him broke. He pushed past the guards who tried to stop him. They shouted at him, but he didn't care. He could feel it, a strange pull inside his chest, a voice that told him his child was in danger. As he ran toward the hall, people began to scream louder, mistaking him for a madman. His dirty clothes and weak body made him look out of place in that world of glitter and gold. But his eyes carried a fire no one could understand. He burst into the hall just as the doctors announced that Adana's heart had stopped beating. The crowd gasped. Chief Raymond shouted for help. But before anyone could stop him, the homeless man, shaking and breathless, dropped to his knees beside the bride, placed his trembling hands on her face, and kissed her lips. A collective cry filled the air. The guests screamed in disgust. The groom lunged forward in rage, but the guards held him back. Everyone watched in horror. Then, suddenly, Adana's body jerked. Her eyes fluttered open. A deep gasp escaped her mouth as she came back to life. The hall went silent. Only the sound of her breathing filled the room. The doctors stared in disbelief. Chief Raymond froze, his anger turning to confusion. Odogwu's body, however, slumped beside her. He fainted, drained of strength. The crowd didn't cheer. They just stared, some trembling, some whispering, some filming. The same man they had mocked moments ago had done what even the doctors couldn't. The ambulance sirens wailed outside the hall as confusion filled the air. Guests stood frozen, unable to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Adana lay weak but conscious, her chest rising and falling steadily. The billionaire groom, Chief Raymond, stood beside her, still trying to understand how a filthy stranger had just done what trained doctors couldn't. The wedding planner, Madame Folklore, rushed forward, her face pale and trembling. She looked at the unconscious homeless man lying beside the bride and covered her mouth in shock. Something about him looked painfully familiar. His eyes, even in their closed state, told a story she thought she had buried years ago. Chief Raymond ordered the guards to drag the man out, but the bride weakly lifted her hand, stopping them. Everyone turned to look at her. Her lips trembled, her eyes filled with tears she could not explain. There was something about that face, that old, weathered face, that pierced deep into her soul. Outside the hall, the police arrived. Inspector Carlu and his team moved in quickly, trying to control the crowd and get statements. The guests were restless, whispering about how a homeless man had kissed the bride in public. Some called it madness. Others called it witchcraft. The medical team lifted Odogwu onto a stretcher, intending to take him to the hospital. Madame Folklore followed closely, her heart pounding. When the ambulance doors closed, she could no longer hold back her tears. She remembered that face. Years ago, she had seen it when Adana was still a child. Back when she and her father used to sell fruits by the roadside to survive. Back inside, Adana sat up slowly, confused and frightened. The priest prayed quietly, while Chief Raymond argued with the police, demanding that the man be arrested for violating his bride. But as the paramedics tried to move Odogwu, his weak voice broke through the noise. He called one name, Adana. The nurse beside him froze. She turned to the bride and said softly, "Madam, he's calling your name." The hall fell silent. Adana rose shakily to her feet and walked toward the stretcher. Her eyes locked on the man's face, her heart pounding faster than it ever had before. The wrinkles, the scars, the faint birthmark near his temple. It all came rushing back to her. She covered her mouth with both hands as tears spilled down her cheeks. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. But it was. The man who had just saved her life was her father. The same man she had abandoned years ago after he lost everything trying to raise her. The crowd gasped as realization spread. Chief Raymond's anger turned to disbelief. Reporters who had come to cover the wedding now began recording the emotional scene, knowing it was bigger than any ceremony. Adana collapsed beside her father, crying uncontrollably. The world around her blurred, the noise fading until all she could hear was her own heartbeat and the sound of his shallow breathing. He had found her again, not as the successful daughter he once dreamed of, but as a broken man who had given his last strength to save her life. The once glamorous wedding venue turned into chaos. Reporters swarmed the gates, their cameras flashing like lightning. What was supposed to be a day of celebration had become a scandal that gripped the entire city. Videos of the shocking kiss flooded social media. Some called it a miracle, others mocked it as madness. Headlines read, "Homeless man kisses bride at billionaire's wedding. Bride revived instantly." Within hours, Chief Raymond's name trended online for all the wrong reasons. The proud billionaire who once commanded respect now stood in shame and fury. His empire, his reputation, his pride, all at risk because of one act he couldn't explain. Inside the hospital, Adana sat beside her father's bed, her eyes swollen from tears. She hadn't left his side since he was brought in. Odogwu lay still, connected to machines that kept him alive. His chest rose and fell weakly, his breathing shallow. Madame Folklore entered quietly and placed a hand on Adana's shoulder. The older woman's eyes carried both guilt and sorrow. She knew the truth that Adana was now remembering piece by piece, the truth that had been hidden for over a decade. Years ago, Adana's father had been one of the most hard-working men in their town. He wasn't wealthy, but he was respected. When his wife fell sick, he spent every coin he had on her treatment. When she passed away, he devoted everything to raising Adana. He sold his land to send her to school in the city, believing that education would change their lives forever. But city life had changed her. Adana, desperate to fit in among wealthy classmates, began to hide her background. She stopped returning his calls. She stopped visiting. She told her friends her parents were dead. When Odogwu visited her university one day, she denied knowing him. The humiliation broke him completely. He lost his home, his business, and eventually his will to live. He disappeared into the streets, surviving on scraps and begging near bus terminals. Now, that same man, the one she had turned her back on, had saved her life in front of the world. As Adana sat there, silent tears ran down her face. Chief Raymond walked into the hospital room with two of his guards. His expression was hard, cold, and full of contempt. He looked at the sleeping old man with disgust. He turned to Adana, his voice low and sharp. Though no words were spoken aloud, his anger filled the air. He didn't need to speak. His look said everything. How could you let this happen? How could a filthy beggar touch you in public? Adana couldn't look at him. The shame was too heavy. The media outside grew louder by the hour. Rumors spread that the marriage had been cancelled. Chief Raymond's family pressured him to end it immediately, warning that marrying a woman connected to a homeless man would ruin his name. Adana's mother tried to calm her daughter, begging her to think carefully before making any decision. But Adana's heart had already chosen. She couldn't go back to that house of pride and arrogance. Not after what she had seen. Not after what her father had done for her. Late that night, as the hospital quieted down, Adana sat beside her father and held his frail hand. The same hands that once carried her through storms were now trembling and weak. She whispered an apology he might never hear, praying silently that he would wake up, not for the world to see, but for her to say thank you. Outside, the world mocked her. Inside, her heart broke in silence. Outside the hospital, journalists, bloggers, and gossip channels filled the entrance, waiting for the latest update. The story had captured every heart and every tongue. The world now wanted to know, who was the homeless man, and what secret bound him to the bride. Inside, Adana's face was pale but calm. She had not slept. The weight of guilt pressed on her chest like a mountain. Every breath reminded her of what she had done to the man lying before her. The world might call him mad, but she knew the truth. He was her father, the one she left behind in poverty while she chased luxury and pride. When Chief Raymond arrived, he came with cameras and reporters. He wanted to control the story before it ruined his empire. Dressed in an expensive black suit, his expression was cold and unforgiving. Behind him walked two bodyguards and his lawyer. The hospital lobby grew silent as he entered. Even the nurses froze. The reporters turned their cameras toward him as he stepped forward and faced Adana. Without words, he handed her a small envelope. Inside was a check and a neatly folded piece of paper, a legal document ending the marriage. The cameras clicked wildly, capturing every move. Adana's hands shook as she read it. The words blurred through her tears, but she understood perfectly. Chief Raymond had cancelled the marriage, accusing her of bringing shame to his name. He turned toward the cameras and, without a word, walked out of the building. His pride had won, but at the cost of his humanity. The humiliation burned deep. Adana fell to her knees, clutching the paper, her heart breaking in silence. Madame Folklore tried to lift her, but she refused to move. For the first time in her life, she realized how fragile status and wealth could be. How quickly the world could turn its back once the spotlight dimmed. That afternoon, Odogwu finally opened his eyes. His breathing was weak, but his gaze was peaceful. He looked around the room, his eyes settling on his daughter. Her tears flowed freely as she held his hand tightly. Though her lips never moved, her eyes said everything. "I'm sorry. I was lost." He smiled faintly, his voice barely a whisper. He lifted his hand and touched her cheek, as if telling her that he had forgiven her long before she knew she needed forgiveness. But before Adana could even process that moment, the door burst open. Inspector Kalu entered with two uniformed officers. In his hand was a report from the city records. He looked troubled, his face lined with disbelief. He approached Adana gently and said, "We ran a background check on your father. Something doesn't add up." The officers handed over a dusty envelope recovered from Odogwu's belongings. Inside it were old photographs, an expired ID card, and a set of documents that told a shocking story. Odogwu was not just a homeless man. Years ago, before his downfall, he had been a respected medical researcher working on experimental treatments for heart failure. He had developed a compound that could stimulate cardiac response through contact, something the world dismissed as impossible. But his research was stolen, his reputation destroyed, and his life shattered by corruption from a powerful businessman who took credit for his work. That businessman was none other than Chief Raymond's late father. The revelation shook Adana to her core. The man she had agreed to marry came from the same bloodline that had destroyed her father's life. It wasn't fate that brought Odogu to that wedding. It was destiny, the closing of a circle that had started years ago. Adana broke down completely. Every lie, every choice, every sacrifice suddenly made sense. Her father had not only saved her life, he had unknowingly saved the daughter of the man whose family had once taken everything from him.